Before we begin, here's some background on the world on the turtle's back. The world on the turtle's back is an Iroquois explanation of how the world was created. The term Iroquois refers to a league of 5 separate Native American peoples: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Oneida, the Onondaga, and the Mohawk, who united in a confederation in the 14th century. The ancestors of today's Iroquois live in the woodlands of what is now New York State, the region roughly extending from the Hudson River in the east to the Great Lakes in the west. The Iroquois groups spoke similar languages, held similar beliefs, and followed similar ways of life. They lived in longhouses made of pole frames covered with elm bark, and they built fences around their villages for protection. The women cultivated squash, beans, and corn, and gathered berries and nuts. The men hunted, fished, and fought with the neighboring Mohican people. Warfare, an important part of the Iroquois culture, gave men power and prestige. The Iroquois League was created primarily to end fighting among the nations that formed the alliance. Okay guys, so I'm about to start reading The World on the Turtle's Back. As I'm going through the reading, I'll try and pause when there's things on the graphic organizer that you should be filling out, because remember, you're looking throughout the story to see how different things from the Iroquois world were created, things like earth, soil, plants, the night sky, etc. Because, as we discussed, a creation myth's whole purpose is to explain how different things in the world were created. It helped the Native Americans make sense of their world. The World on the Turtle's Back. In the beginning, there was no world, no land, no creatures of the kind that are around us now, and there were no men. But there was a great ocean which occupied space as far as anyone could see. Above the ocean was a great void of air, and in the air there lived the birds of the sea. In the ocean lived the fish and the creatures of the deep. Far above this unpeopled world there was a sky world. Here lived gods who were like people, like Iroquois. In the sky world there was a man who had a wife, and the wife was expecting a child. The woman became hungry for all kinds of strange delicacies, as women do when they are with child. She kept her husband busy almost to distraction finding delicious things for her to eat. In the middle of the sky world there grew a great tree which was not like any of the trees that we know. It was tremendous. It had grown there forever. It had enormous roots that spread out from the floor of the sky world, and on its branches there were many different kinds of leaves and different kinds of fruits and flowers. The tree was not supposed to be marked or mutilated by any of the beings who dwelt in the sky world. It was a sacred tree that stood at the center of the universe. So pause here and think, what from our own cultural myths does the sky world and the great tree remind you of? The woman decided that she wanted some bark from one of the roots of the great tree, perhaps as a food or as a medicine, we don't know. She told her husband this. He didn't like the idea, he knew it was wrong, but she insisted and he gave in. So he dug a hole among the roots of this great sky tree and he bared some of its roots. But the floor of the sky world wasn't very thick and he broke a hole through it. He was terrified, for he had never expected to find empty space underneath the world. But his wife was filled with curiosity. He wouldn't get any of the roots for her, so she set out to do it herself. She bent over and she looked down, and she saw the ocean far below. She leaned down and stuck her head through the hole and looked all around. No one knows just what happened next. Some say she slipped. Some say that her husband, fed up with all the demands she had made on him, pushed her. So she fell through the hole. As she fell, she frantically grabbed at its edges, but her hands slipped. However, between her fingers there clung bits of things that were growing on the floor of the sky world, and bits of the root tips of the great tree, and so she began to fall toward the great ocean far below. The birds of the sea saw the woman falling, and they immediately consulted with each other as to what they could do to help her. Flying wingtip to wingtip, they made a great feathery raft in the sky to support her, and thus they broke her fall. But of course, it was not possible for them to carry the woman very long. Some of the other birds of the sky flew down to the surface of the ocean and called up the ocean creatures to see what they could do to help. The great sea turtle came and agreed to receive her on his back. The birds placed her gently on the shell of the turtle, and now the turtle floated about on the huge ocean with the woman safely on his back. The beings up in the sky world paid no attention to this. They knew what was happening, but they chose to ignore it. When the woman recovered from her shock and terror, she looked around her. All that she could see were the birds and the sea creatures in the sky and the ocean. And the woman said to herself that she would die. But the creatures of the sea came to her and said that they would try to help her and asked her what they could do. She told them that if they could find some soil, she could plant the roots stuck between her fingers, and from them plants would grow. The sea animals said perhaps there was dirt at the bottom of the ocean, but no one had ever been down there, so they could not be sure. If there was dirt at the bottom of the ocean, it was far, far below the surface in the cold deeps. But the animals said they would try to get some. One by one, the diving birds and animals tried and failed. They went to the limits of their endurance, but they could not get to the bottom of the ocean. Finally, the muskrat said he would try. He dived and disappeared. All the creatures waited, holding their breath, but he did not return. After a long time, his little body floated up to the surface of the ocean, a tiny crumb of earth clutched in his paw. He seemed to be dead. They pulled him up on the turtle's back, and they sang and prayed over him and breathed air into his mouth, and finally he stirred. Thus it was the muskrat, the earth diver, who brought from the bottom of the ocean the soil from which the earth was to grow. At this point, you should be able to fill in on your graphic organizer how the earth came to be and how soil came to be. The woman took the tiny clod of dirt and placed it on the middle of the great sea turtle's back. Then the woman began to walk in a circle around it, moving in the direction that the sun goes. The earth began to grow. When the earth was big enough, she planted the roots she had clutched between her fingers when she fell from the sky world. Thus the plants grew on the earth. To keep the earth growing, the woman walked as the sun goes, moving in the direction that the people still move in the dance rituals. She gathered roots and plants to eat and built herself a little hut. After a while, the woman's time came, and she was delivered of a daughter. The woman and her daughter kept walking in a circle around the earth, so that the earth and plants would continue to grow. They lived on the plants and roots they gathered. The girl grew up with her mother, cut off forever from the sky world above, knowing only the birds and the creatures of the sea, seeing no other beings like herself. One day, when the girl had grown to womanhood, a man appeared. No one knows for sure who this man was. He had something to do with the gods above. Perhaps he was the west wind. As the girl looked at him, she was filled with a terror and amazement and warmth, and she fainted dead away. As she lay on the ground, the man reached into his quiver, and he took out 2 arrows, one sharp and one blunt, and he laid them across the body of the girl and quietly went away. When the girl awoke from her faint, she and her mother continued to walk around the earth. After a while, they knew that the girl was to bear a child. They did not know it, but the girl was to bear twins. At this point, you should be able to fill in on your graphic organizer how plants came to be and how the twins came to be.